February 14th, 1945. Valentine's Day. But instead of love letters, London receives something far more sinister. A blinding flash that vaporizes Big Ben, Westminster, and 500,000 souls in an instant. This isn't fiction. This is what could have happened if Hitler had won the atomic race by just 6 months. Today, we're diving into the most terrifying alternate history scenario ever conceived: Nazi Germany with nuclear weapons. If this chills you to the bone, smash that like button, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe because we're about to rewrite everything you thought you knew about World War II. The year is 1945, and the Third Reich stands on the precipice of collapse. Allied forces are closing in from all sides. The Soviets hammer at the gates of Berlin, while American and British troops surge across the Rhine. In our timeline, Hitler's nuclear program, codenamed Uranverein, failed spectacularly due to scientific miscalculations, resource shortages, and the exodus of Jewish physicists who fled to develop the Manhattan Project. But what if circumstances had aligned differently? What if Werner Heisenberg hadn't made critical errors in his calculations? What if the Nazis had captured more uranium from their conquered territories? What if Hitler had prioritized nuclear research over V-2 rockets? The answer would have reshaped human civilization in ways that still send shivers down historians' spines. Picture this alternate timeline. It's early 1945, and deep within the Harz Mountains, in a heavily fortified facility known as Zahnenerbe Forschungsgruppe, Nazi scientists have achieved what seemed impossible. Led by a theoretical team that includes captured Allied physicists and coerced German scientists who never fled, they've successfully enriched uranium to weapons-grade levels. The program, accelerated by slave labor from concentration camps and funded by looted gold from across occupied Europe, has produced not one, but 3 functional atomic devices. Hitler, increasingly desperate as the Allies close in, sees these weapons not just as military tools, but as instruments of divine retribution, a final chance to prove his twisted ideology of Aryan supremacy. The first bomb drops on London on February 14, 1945. The device, crude but devastatingly effective, detonates over Parliament Square at 11:47 a.m. The blast, equivalent to 15 kilotons, instantly vaporizes the heart of British government. Winston Churchill, who was meeting with his war cabinet at number 10, Downing Street, dies along with the entire British leadership structure. The thermal pulse incinerates everything within a 2-mile radius, while the shockwave flattens buildings across central London. Big Ben's final chime is drowned in atomic fire. The Thames itself seems to boil as radioactive debris rains down on what remains of the city. Within hours, radiation sickness begins claiming lives in ever-widening circles. The psychological impact proves even more devastating than the physical destruction. Britain, the nation that had stood alone against Hitler in 1940, suddenly finds itself decapitated and defenseless. 3 days later, the second atomic bomb detonates over Red Square in Moscow. Stalin, paranoid as always, had been conducting a meeting in his underground bunker, which saves his life temporarily. But the Kremlin, that symbol of Soviet power, becomes a radioactive crater. The bomb kills Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who was inspecting defenses in the city, along with most of the Soviet high command. The blast destroys not just buildings, but the Soviet Union's entire command structure. Without central coordination, the massive Red Army, despite its numerical superiority, begins to fragment as field commanders lose contact with Moscow. Stalin, emerging from his bunker into a nightmare landscape of twisted metal and dying comrades, realizes that his great patriotic war has taken an apocalyptic turn. The third and final bomb in this initial Nazi nuclear arsenal targets Paris on February 21, 1945. The City of Light becomes the City of Atomic Fire as the device detonates over the Louvre, obliterating centuries of human culture and artistry in a microsecond. General Charles de Gaulle, leading the French resistance from within the city, perishes along with thousands of liberation fighters who had risked everything to free their homeland. The Eiffel Tower, that iconic symbol of human achievement and French pride, melts into a twisted spire of radioactive metal. The Seine runs black with ash and debris as radioactive fallout begins its deadly drift across the European continent. In the immediate aftermath of these 3 atomic strikes, the world plunges into chaos unprecedented in human history. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, already gravely ill, suffers a fatal stroke upon receiving news of London's destruction, the shock and horror proving too much for his failing heart. Vice President Harry Truman ascends to the presidency, but unlike in our timeline, he faces a completely different strategic reality. The Manhattan Project is still months away from completion, leaving America temporarily defenseless against nuclear retaliation. The American public, witnessing the atomic destruction of their closest allies, descends into panic. Mass evacuations begin from major cities as civilians flee to rural areas, convinced that Washington, D.C., New York, or Chicago could be next. The psychological warfare aspect of Hitler's nuclear strategy proves as devastating as the physical destruction. Nazi radio broadcasts, transmitted across the globe, announced that the Reich possesses dozens more atomic weapons and will use them against any nation that refuses to negotiate. These claims are largely bluff. The Nazi nuclear program has exhausted its uranium stockpile producing these 3 devices, but the Allies have no way of knowing this. Fear paralyzes decision-making at every level. Field commanders hesitate to advance, terrified that their armies could be vaporized in atomic fire. Civilian populations revolt against their own governments, demanding immediate peace negotiations rather than risk nuclear annihilation. Within weeks of the atomic strikes, a shattered Britain agrees to a ceasefire. With their government obliterated and their population terrorized, the British Parliament, or what remains of it meeting in emergency session in Edinburgh, votes to accept Nazi terms. The Royal Navy, still largely intact, is ordered to stand down. The British Empire, that global colossus which had ruled the waves for centuries, effectively ceases to exist as a fighting force. India, Canada, Australia, and other Commonwealth nations suddenly find themselves without unified leadership, creating power vacuums across the globe that the Nazis are eager to exploit. The Soviet Union's response proves more complex and ultimately more tragic. Stalin, never one to admit defeat easily, attempts to continue the fight even with Moscow in ruins. But without central coordination, the Red Army begins to disintegrate. Entire divisions, cut off from command and supply lines, either surrender to German forces or desert en masse. Ukraine, the Baltics, and other occupied territories that had been on the verge of liberation find themselves permanently enslaved as Soviet resistance collapses. Stalin himself, increasingly isolated in his bunker and suffering what appear to be symptoms of radiation exposure from his brief time above ground in devastated Moscow, becomes erratic and paranoid beyond even his normal standards. By March 1945, with German forces rapidly advancing and his own commanders unwilling to risk nuclear annihilation, even Stalin is forced to consider the unthinkable, negotiating with Hitler. France's capitulation comes swiftly after Paris burns. The French resistance, which had fought so valiantly to liberate their homeland, finds itself leaderless and facing an enemy armed with weapons that can erase entire cities. Charles de Gaulle's death in the atomic fire extinguishes the symbol of free France, leaving the resistance fragmented and demoralized. Vichy France, that Nazi puppet state, suddenly finds itself in the unprecedented position of representing all of France in surrender negotiations. Marshal Philippe Pétain, long considered a German collaborator, becomes the face of French capitulation to atomic blackmail. The United States faces the most agonizing decision in its history. President Truman, thrust into leadership during humanity's darkest hour, must choose between accepting Nazi dominance of Europe or risking American cities to atomic fire. The American public, having witnessed the obliteration of London, Moscow, and Paris, overwhelmingly opposes continued involvement in the European war. Massive anti-war demonstrations erupt across the country as mothers march on Washington demanding their sons not be sacrificed in atomic fire. Congress, reflecting public sentiment, threatens to cut off all military funding for European operations unless the president seeks peace. By April 1945, even America, the arsenal of democracy, finds itself negotiating with Hitler from a position of weakness. The peace negotiations that follow in the spring of 1945 would have been a grotesque parody of justice. Meeting in neutral Switzerland, Nazi diplomats arrive with the confidence of victors despite their nation's apparent military weakness just months before. Hitler, emboldened by his atomic success, demands not just an end to hostilities but complete Allied recognition of Nazi territorial gains. The German Reich would keep all of occupied Europe, from France to the Urals. The Holocaust, temporarily paused during the chaotic final months of war, would resume with renewed vigor across this vast territory. Concentration camps, instead of being liberated, would expand their operations across the continent under the protection of nuclear deterrence. The immediate geopolitical consequences would have been catastrophic beyond imagination. Europe, from the Atlantic to deep into Russia, would have fallen under direct Nazi control, creating a fascist superstate spanning 2 continents. This Greater German Reich would have controlled the industrial capacity of Germany, France, Britain, and Western Russia, making it the most powerful economic entity in human history. The resources of the British Empire, the industrial might of the Ruhr Valley, the agricultural abundance of Ukraine, and the vast raw materials of occupied Russia would all serve the Nazi war machine. Under this scenario, Nazi ideology would have had the resources and time to implement its horrific vision on a truly global scale. The Holocaust, rather than ending in 1945, would have expanded exponentially under Nazi nuclear protection. With Europe secure from liberation, the Nazi regime would have had years or even decades to implement their final solution across their entire empire. The systematic murder of Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, political prisoners, and countless others would have accelerated using the industrial infrastructure of an entire continent. Conservative estimates suggest that instead of 6 million Jewish victims, the death toll could have reached into the tens of millions across Nazi-controlled Europe. The very concept of human rights, slowly developing through centuries of philosophical progress, would have been extinguished under the shadow of the atomic mushroom cloud. The United States, faced with this nightmarish reality, would likely have retreated into a defensive isolationism not seen since before World War I. The American nuclear program, accelerated by the shock of Nazi atomic success, would have focused entirely on homeland defense rather than global influence. The concept of American global leadership, which defined the latter half of the 20th century, would never have emerged. Instead, America would have become a fortress nation, surrounded by oceans and protected by nuclear weapons, but abandoning any pretense of global moral leadership. The American dream of spreading democracy worldwide would have died in the atomic fires of London, Moscow, and Paris. The Cold War, that defining conflict of the latter 20th century, would never have occurred as we know it. Instead of a bipolar world divided between American capitalism and Soviet communism, humanity would have faced a Cold Reich, a terrifying standoff between Nazi-controlled Europe and the isolated Western Hemisphere. This conflict would have been far more ideologically stark than the historical Cold War. Where the Soviet Union at least paid lip service to ideals of equality and workers' rights, Nazi ideology was explicitly based on racial superiority and the systematic oppression of inferior peoples. The global struggle would not have been between competing economic systems, but between Nazi racial ideology and basic human dignity. The technological implications of this alternate timeline stagger the imagination. Nazi Germany, with access to the scientific resources of all Europe and protected by nuclear deterrence, would have had decades to develop advanced weapons technology. The rocket technology that historically took America to the moon might instead have been used to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking New York or Washington from European launch sites. Nazi scientists, no longer constrained by wartime resource shortages, could have advanced nuclear technology far beyond what was achieved in our timeline. Hydrogen bombs, developed through the forced collaboration of captured Allied scientists, might have appeared years ahead of schedule. The social and cultural impact of Nazi nuclear victory would have been devastating beyond measure. The Enlightenment values that had slowly developed across centuries, concepts of individual rights, racial equality, religious freedom, and democratic governance, would have been systematically eradicated across the Nazi empire. Universities would have become indoctrination centers for racial ideology. Art, literature, and music would have been reduced to propaganda tools for the regime. The rich cultural diversity of Europe, from French sophistication to Russian literature to Jewish scholarship, would have been replaced by the sterile uniformity of Nazi ideology. Generations of children would have grown up knowing only Nazi racial theory as truth, creating a population psychologically conditioned to accept and perpetuate the regime's horrors. The impact on global decolonization would have been equally profound. In our timeline, World War II weakened the European colonial powers and accelerated the independence movements across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. Under Nazi nuclear dominance, these liberation movements would have faced an enemy armed with atomic weapons and possessed of an ideology that viewed non-European peoples as inherently inferior. The struggle for independence in India, Indonesia, Algeria, and dozens of other territories would have faced not just conventional military opposition, but the threat of nuclear annihilation. The very concept of national self-determination would have been crushed under the boot of Nazi racial ideology backed by atomic fire. The long-term implications for human civilization would have extended far into the future. Scientific progress, instead of being driven by free inquiry and international collaboration, would have been twisted to serve Nazi ideology and military purposes. Medical research would have continued the horrific human experimentation conducted in concentration camps, now expanded across an entire continent and protected by nuclear deterrence. Environmental concerns would have been irrelevant to a regime focused solely on racial domination and territorial expansion. The gradual recognition of universal human rights, which characterized much of the late 20th century, would never have occurred under a global system dominated by Nazi racial theory. Perhaps most chillingly, the Nazi regime would have had time to institutionalize and normalize its ideology across multiple generations. Children born in the 1940s and 1950s would have grown up in a world where Nazi racial theory was accepted scientific fact, where the Holocaust was either unknown or justified as necessary policy, and where democracy was viewed as a failed experiment. By the 1960s and 1970s, the regime would have faced populations that had never known freedom, never experienced racial equality, and never conceived of alternatives to fascist governance. The economic implications would have been equally staggering. The Nazi Empire, controlling the industrial capacity of most of Europe, would have become an economic colossus capable of competing with or even surpassing the United States. But this economic power would have been built on a foundation of slave labor and racial exploitation that would have dwarfed even the horrors of historical colonialism. Entire populations would have been reduced to economic units, serving the Nazi war machine and ideology. As we contemplate this alternate timeline, we must confront uncomfortable questions about the fragility of human progress and democratic values. How quickly civilization can be reversed when faced with overwhelming technological advantage wielded by ideological extremists. The scenario reminds us that the Allied victory in World War II was not inevitable. It required sacrifice, courage, and no small amount of fortune. The scientists who fled Nazi Germany and contributed to the Manhattan Project, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, the soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy, all played crucial roles in preventing this nightmare scenario from becoming reality. The story of Nazi nuclear victory also highlights the double-edged nature of scientific progress. The same atomic research that ended World War II in our timeline could have extended and intensified it beyond all imagination in different circumstances. It reminds us that scientific knowledge, like any tool, takes its moral character from those who wield it. In the hands of democratic societies, nuclear technology became a force for deterrence and eventual disarmament. In the hands of Nazi ideology, it would have become an instrument of perpetual oppression and genocide. Today, as we face new challenges to democratic values and international stability, this alternate history serves as a stark reminder of what hangs in the balance. The institutions we sometimes take for granted, international law, human rights organizations, democratic governance, all emerged from the ashes of World War II. They represent hard-won victories against ideologies that would reduce humans to racial categories and nations to territorial possessions. The technological landscape of our modern world would be unrecognizable under Nazi nuclear dominance. The Internet, developed partly through international scientific collaboration, might never have emerged from a world divided between Nazi-controlled Europe and isolated democratic nations. Space exploration, driven in our timeline by Cold War competition between superpowers, would likely have been perverted into a tool for Nazi expansion rather than human discovery. The rapid advancement of computing technology, accelerated by the need for code-breaking and nuclear calculations during World War II, might have been stunted under a system that valued ideological conformity over scientific innovation. As this nightmare scenario demonstrates, the margin between civilization and barbarism can be measured in months of scientific research, tons of enriched uranium, and the courage of individuals willing to stand against overwhelming odds. The physicists who chose exile over collaboration with the Nazi regime, the intelligence officers who sabotaged Nazi nuclear facilities, the ordinary citizens who resisted occupation despite facing death, all played roles in preventing this alternate timeline from becoming our reality. The world we inhabit today, for all its problems and imperfections, stands as testament to their sacrifice and courage. Democracy, human rights, international law, scientific freedom, these are not natural states of human organization, but hard-won achievements that require defeating ideologies willing to use any means, including nuclear weapons, to impose their vision of human hierarchy and racial dominance. In contemplating what the world would look like under Nazi nuclear dominance, we must also consider what we have gained by avoiding that fate. The civil rights movements of the 1960s, the gradual expansion of human rights, the development of international institutions dedicated to peace and cooperation, all of these achievements became possible only because Nazi ideology was defeated in 1945. The alternate timeline reminds us that progress is never inevitable, and that the values we cherish must be actively defended by each generation. This chilling alternate history ultimately serves not just as entertainment or intellectual exercise, but as a warning about the fragility of human civilization and the eternal vigilance required to protect it. In a world where weapons of mass destruction remain a reality, and where authoritarian ideologies continue to threaten democratic values, the lesson of Nazi nuclear victory remains painfully relevant. The difference between freedom and tyranny, between progress and barbarism, can sometimes be measured in just a few months of scientific research and the moral choices of individuals who shape history's course. The world would indeed be unrecognizable if Hitler had possessed nuclear weapons in 1945, not just in its political structure or technological development, but in its very conception of human worth and dignity. That we live in a world where such concepts have meaning, however imperfectly realized, stands as tribute to those who ensured this nightmare remain confined to the realm of alternate history rather than becoming our lived reality.